Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The night my mother invited me to her birthday, I walked into what I thought was going to be an ordinary family dinner where people eat, make small talk, and then leave with the same mild frustrations they always carry home. But instead it turned into a staged performance where she used her big moment not to celebrate herself, but to humiliate me in front of a room full of people who were half family and half her friends. She raised her glass and, with that fake sweet smile that I had grown up watching, announced that she had decided to cut me out of her will because I was, in her words, disrespectful and ungrateful. I could feel the silence stretch across the table like a heavy curtain, and I saw people glance at me with pity, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to plead or cry or at least look wounded. But I did not give them any of that because I had already decided weeks earlier that her money no longer defined me and her approval was no longer a currency I was willing to fight for. What nobody in that room knew, not even my brother Mark, who always seemed to know her next move before anyone else, was that I had been preparing for this very moment for a long time. I had already sat down with my friend Tasha over countless coffees and laid out every instance where financial help from my mother had come with conditions that were less about generosity and more about control. She had paid my rent once when I was in grad school, but only after extracting a promise that I would drive home every other weekend to help her with errands. She had bailed me out when my car broke down years ago, but not before making me agree to spend Christmas with a man I had broken up with, just because she liked him better than the person I was actually dating. It was never about the money itself. It was about making sure I knew that nothing in life came without strings if it passed through her hands. I remember sitting with Tasha as she said, "You realize this isn't support, right? It's a leash." And for the first time in my life, I admitted out loud that she was right. That was when I called Ms. Patel, a local attorney who explained to me how wills work, how trusts bypass them, and how the most powerful choice someone can make is to stop counting on money they don't control. That conversation shifted something in me because for years I thought if I just stayed patient and played along, maybe things would balance out in the end. But Patel made me see that the end never comes if you keep giving in. It just resets and traps you again. So when my mother made her grand announcement at the table, instead of shrinking into my chair, I calmly pulled out an envelope I had tucked into my bag before leaving the house. Inside was a notarized letter I had signed weeks earlier, formally releasing any claim to her estate. I had written it not as an act of anger, but as a shield for myself, a way of making sure she could never dangle her money over me again, and I handed it to her right there in front of everyone. People gasped, and I could feel their eyes moving back and forth between us like it was a tennis match, waiting for her to lash out, but she froze. She didn't expect me to be ready, and for once, she had no script to read from. I told her, in a calm voice, that I appreciated the clarity, but that I had already built a life where her financial decisions no longer determined my future. I could see Mark's jaw tighten, because if I wasn't going to be desperate anymore, then the game they had played together for years was starting to lose its power. To make the point clear, I pulled out a second item, an old check she had given me years ago for emergencies, which I had never cashed. I had kept it in a drawer, not because I needed it, but because I wanted a physical reminder of what her so-called generosity really meant. I slid it back across the table and told her that I would never owe her a thank you she could cash in later. The silence was brutal, and for once, it was hers to sit in, not mine. I raised my glass, not in celebration of her birthday, but in celebration of finally being free of the quiet debt that had defined so much of our relationship. I smiled, not smugly, but with the kind of relief that only comes when you finally stop waiting for someone else's approval to feel whole. And then, just as people thought the tension had peaked, I placed another envelope on the table, smaller than the first one but far heavier in meaning. I looked directly at her and said, "This one you didn't see coming." The air in the room shifted, and I could tell that every single person sitting there was wondering what on earth I had just set in motion. Because the truth is, that envelope wasn't about me claiming independence. It was about me holding receipts, real ones, and once they were opened, nobody at that table would ever see her the same way again. When I slid that second envelope across the table, the one smaller than the letter I had already handed over, but carrying a weight she had not anticipated, I saw my mother's smile falter in a way that only I would notice, because I had spent a lifetime studying every twitch of her face, every forced chuckle, every shift in tone that revealed whether she felt in control or exposed. And in that moment she realized that I had not come to her birthday party to play the role of the dutiful daughter, waiting for crumbs, but rather as someone who was prepared to change the script entirely. Inside that envelope were printed copies of messages she had sent me over the years, messages where financial help was directly tied to obedience, where she reminded me that attending a holiday gathering with a man I had broken up with was the condition for receiving a loan for car repairs, where she told me that if I did not show up at a fundraiser with her, she would reconsider paying for the small surgery I needed at the time, where she tied silence about my brother Mark's repeated financial disasters to offers of support that were really just hush money. I did not read them out loud. I simply said, "I keep records so people don't rewrite history," and I let that sentence hang in the air long enough for everyone to imagine what those records must contain. The truth is that for years she relied on the fact that nobody would question her version of events because she was always the loudest voice in the room, the one with the veneer of generosity and charm that made outsiders believe she was the backbone of the family. But what she never considered was that I had quietly been saving every text, every email, and every voicemail, not because I wanted to someday blackmail her, but because I knew one day I would need to remind myself that I was not crazy, that the patterns I felt were not imagined, and that the manipulation I lived under was real and calculated. When I finally gathered them into a neat packet, printed with dates and times, I felt a power shift inside me that was subtle but irreversible, because once you hold proof in your hand, the gaslighting loses its grip. After the dinner ended, when the whispers and the awkward smiles had scattered into the night, I sat down at my computer and wrote a short email to the extended family. I did not rant, I did not insult, and I did not pour out years of pain. I simply stated 3 facts. In 1 year, I had been pressured to co-sign for Mark's personal loan under the promise that it was temporary. Yet my name remained attached for over a decade. In another year, I had been asked to temporarily cover the property taxes on my mother's house with the assurance I would be paid back, but no repayment ever arrived, and in yet another year, my credit score had been damaged by a card opened in my name without my consent while I was in college. I closed the email by saying that I was bowing out of inheritance discussions, stepping back from unpaid family errands, and focusing my energy on building a life that was no longer managed by favors disguised as gifts. I included no commentary and no emotional appeals, only documented facts, and I hit send knowing that silence would follow, because nothing dismantles a narrative faster than receipts that speak without blinking. The reaction was not immediate, but within days I began receiving calls that carried a different tone. A cousin who had always believed I was the dramatic one admitted quietly that she had seen hints of this dynamic for years, but never said anything. An aunt who always deferred to my mother sent me a brief note saying she had once been pressured into co-signing for Mark too, but stayed quiet out of fear of being cut off. For the first time, I realized I was not as isolated as I had been led to believe, and that realization felt like oxygen after years of suffocating under my mother's version of events. But of course, exposing manipulation comes with consequences, and the first was Mark calling me late at night, his voice dripping with the same mixture of entitlement and panic I had grown used to hearing. He told me, in a tone that tried to sound casual but was really just angry, that Mom had said I would still be her medical contact, that no matter what I claimed in an email, I would always be the one she relied on in emergencies because that's what daughters do. I listened, and instead of exploding or defending myself, I calmly told him that things had changed, that the old arrangements were over, and that if he believed I would continue to carry responsibilities without recognition or choice, then he had not understood what the envelopes at the party really meant. What he did not realize was that I had already taken the first steps to make sure my boundaries were not just verbal declarations but legally recognized facts. I had met with Ms. Patel again, and she explained how I could formally remove myself from being my mother's default emergency contact, how I could ensure that medical institutions, insurance companies, and legal documents no longer listed me as the responsible party without my consent. For the first time, no would not be a word my family could simply talk me out of. It would be a fact embedded in paperwork. And that is why, when Mark tried to pressure me on the phone, I did not shout or argue, because the decision had already been made, the forms were already in progress, and my voice carried the calm of someone who knew the trap had already been disarmed. I ended the call by telling him one sentence that I knew would haunt him more than any lecture: "You might want to get used to being the one mom calls first." Because the truth was, for decades, my mother had built a system where I absorbed the consequences of everyone else's choices while she pretended it was love, but now the system had a crack running straight through it, and once cracks appear, walls never stand the same again. When Mark called me that night and repeated my mother's line that no matter what paperwork I thought I had, I would still end up being her medical contact because that's what daughters do, I realized in that exact moment that the only way to end this cycle of expectation, manipulation, and guilt was to take every word I had spoken and carve it into documents that could not be twisted, reinterpreted, or erased with a raised eyebrow or a guilt-laden speech about family duty, because for my entire life, my mother had survived on the assumption that I would always bend rather than break, that I would always cover the gaps left by her decisions and Mark's irresponsibility, and that I would never have the courage to put in writing the boundaries that had only lived in my head. I hung up the phone, sat there in the quiet of my living room with my laptop open, and told myself out loud that this was the moment to stop being their insurance policy, their fallback plan, their safety net, disguised as love. The next morning I called Ms. Patel, and I laid out the situation with a bluntness that surprised even me, telling her that I wanted every medical institution, every insurance company, and every legal file that had my name written down as my mother's responsible person to be changed immediately, because I was no longer willing to carry responsibilities that had been placed on me without my consent, responsibilities that were never acknowledged, never appreciated, and never truly mine to begin with. She told me that this was not only possible but necessary, that consent mattered in these matters more than cultural expectation, and that a no delivered in the form of a notarized document carried more weight than 1,000 family arguments ever could. Together we drafted letters, filed refusals, and contacted the hospital system where my mother had listed me as her first call for decades, and I signed forms that explicitly stated I would not serve as her medical proxy or emergency contact. For the first time in my life, my no was not just a word, it was a legal fact. At the same time, Patel urged me to clean up the mess from my past that I had always shoved into the corners of my mind, like the credit card my mother had opened in my name when I was barely 20 and too overwhelmed with school to question her insistence that it was just to build my credit. That card, of course, was used for expenses that were never mine, left unpaid until I begged her to settle it, and sat like a shadow on my credit report for years, reminding me that even my financial identity was never truly my own. So I filed the necessary affidavit, declared the fraud, and finally separated my history from hers in the only way that mattered on paper, in black and white, signed and sealed by an authority higher than family guilt. What stunned me was how freeing it felt to know that the next time the phone rang with a hospital number, I could answer not with dread or obligation, but with calm detachment, because I had already ensured that they would not be calling me first, and if they did, I had a document to point them to that confirmed I was not their fallback. The truth was that I was not abandoning my mother, because I would still show up when I chose to, still visit when I wanted, and still speak to doctors if I felt it was right, but the difference was that I had reclaimed the choice, and without choice there is no real love, only servitude. When I finally informed my mother of what I had done, her reaction was almost comical in its predictability, because she did not scream or cry, but instead adopted that familiar tone of wounded martyrdom, the one she had used on me since childhood, telling me that a daughter who truly cared would never go to such lengths to legally separate herself, that I was cold, ungrateful, and heartless for treating her like a stranger. I listened without interrupting, and then I told her that boundaries are not a lack of love. They are the only way love can survive without suffocation, and if she could not understand that, then at least she would understand that the law now backed me up. The part that cut her the deepest was not the legal forms, though, but the email I sent afterward, a simple message copied to both her and Mark with a list of local elder law attorneys, care coordinators, and community resources that could help them navigate whatever emergencies might come in the future. I told them, in one clear paragraph, that I had removed myself from those roles, that I encouraged them to plan accordingly, and that I wished them well in creating a structure that did not depend on me being available at all hours. For the first time, the weight of care was placed back in their hands, where it always should have been. Mark's response was exactly what I expected, anger laced with sarcasm, accusations that I was selfish, claims that I was abandoning family values. But what he never said out loud was the truth we both knew, that he was terrified. Because the responsibility he had dodged for decades was finally circling back to him, and there was no longer a younger sister willing to absorb the impact. My mother, on the other hand, went silent, which was worse than yelling, because silence from her meant she was recalculating, trying to figure out how to spin this in her favor, how to make sure she came out still looking like the victim. But this time the spin would not work, because the documents were filed, the institutions notified, and the line drawn so deeply it could not be erased. A week later, when I thought the dust was starting to settle, I came home to find an envelope from a title company sitting in my mailbox, and when I opened it, I realized that the story I thought I was controlling had just taken another turn. It was addressed to me because my name had somehow been attached as a backup contact for a transaction involving my mother's house, and as I read through the paperwork, I saw words that made my stomach tighten: transfer, lien, and cash out. It was then that I understood this fight was not just about wills or medical forms, it was about the house I grew up in, the one she always described as the family anchor, and it was about secrets buried in deeds and loans that I had never been told about. In that moment, holding the title company's envelope in my hands, I realized that what had begun as a battle over inheritance had just escalated into something far bigger, something tied not only to money, but to reputation, legacy, and the very history of our family. And once again I smiled, because I knew I had more receipts, and this time, they were not about texts or emails, they were carved into the history of the very roof she lived under. When I opened the envelope from the title company and saw my name printed on paperwork tied to a property transfer I had never consented to, I felt the kind of cold clarity that only comes when you realize the rules of the game have been rewritten behind your back, because this wasn't just about a will or a medical form anymore. This was about the house that had always been described as the untouchable anchor of our family, the place my mother claimed would always belong to us, and yet here it was, leveraged and manipulated in ways that made it obvious that sentiment had never been the guiding principle money had. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, reading terms like lien, equity line, and cash-out refinance. And each one felt like a quiet confession that the so-called stability of our family home had been used for years as a bank account for Mark's repeated failures, while I had been made to feel guilty for every small request I dared make for myself. The next morning, I called the title company directly and requested a full history of the deed, and when the packet arrived a week later, I flipped through page after page of transfers, loans, and liens that painted a very different picture of what family legacy meant in our house. My mother had pulled equity out of the home multiple times, always under the guise of helping Mark get a fresh start, and each time she told me we had to sacrifice for family, she never mentioned that the sacrifice wasn't equal, that the financial foundation was being chipped away to fund his mistakes, while my contributions were dismissed as obligations rather than valued efforts. It was in those records that I saw clearly for the first time what I had always suspected. The story of fairness she told me was a script meant to keep me quiet, while the real story was written in contracts and signatures I had never been shown. As I sat with those documents, I thought about the one object my mother had always dangled in front of me as proof that she wasn't biased, the one promise she repeated whenever I questioned the imbalance, which was that my grandmother's ring would someday be mine. That ring was not extraordinary in terms of size or beauty, but it carried a weight far beyond its appearance, because it was always presented as the symbol of fairness, the tangible proof that my patience and loyalty would be rewarded. Every time I swallowed my anger or silenced my objections, she would tap her finger against that ring and remind me, "This will be yours. You just have to trust me." What I only realized now was that the ring wasn't a gift waiting for me, it was a contract, a silent agreement that as long as I kept playing by her rules, I would eventually be compensated. And that realization made me furious in a way I had never allowed myself to feel before. I took the ring, which she had let me hold briefly a few years earlier but insisted I return to her for safekeeping, to a jeweler for appraisal, and I nearly laughed when I heard the number, because it was worth far less than the emotional control it had exerted over me for decades. The jeweler described it as modest, outdated, sentimental at best, and in that moment, I understood that the value of the ring was never financial, it was psychological. It was the constant reminder that I had to earn what should have been given freely, and that if I ever dared to step out of line, even that promise could vanish. Rather than rage or despair, what I felt was a new kind of determination, because I realized I had the power to strip the ring of its manipulative weight and redefine its meaning. I invited my niece Emma, Mark's teenage daughter, to meet me for coffee, and I brought the ring with me, not as a prize to flaunt, but as a story to share. I told her about the promises tied to it, about how it had been used to keep me obedient, about how it was dangled as proof of love that was never unconditional. I placed the ring in her hand and told her she could keep it if she wanted, sell it if she needed, or lock it in a drawer and forget it existed. But I added one condition written on a small card I handed to her. Wear it if it makes you feel strong. If it ever makes you feel owned, sell it. The look on her face told me everything I needed to know, because in that moment, the chain that had bound me was broken, not because the ring changed hands, but because its meaning had been rewritten forever. I later texted my mother a photo of Emma holding the card, not as an act of cruelty, but as a declaration that the heirloom she had used as leverage for years was no longer a weapon. It was now a choice in the hands of the next generation, free of her conditions and free of her control. When my mother saw that, her silence was deafening, because for the first time, she realized that I had taken away the one piece of symbolic power she thought she still held over me. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about houses, and it wasn't even about inheritance anymore. It was about rewriting the narrative of what family meant, and she no longer got to be the sole author. Just when I thought the air might finally settle, the phone rang, and it wasn't my mother this time. It was her banker, a man I had never spoken to before, who politely asked me if I was aware of a planned transfer naming me as backup on a new account. That question hit me harder than any confrontation at a birthday dinner, because it meant that, even after all of this, she was still trying to tie my name to her decisions, still trying to weave me into responsibilities I hadn't agreed to. And as I hung up the phone, I knew that the next move would not be about symbols or receipts. It would be about securing my future in a way that left no cracks, no loopholes, and no way for her to pull me back into the game. When the banker called and asked me, in that measured professional voice that made it clear he assumed I already knew what was happening, whether I was aware that my name had been listed as a backup on a new account my mother had just opened, I felt the weight of everything I had been fighting against crystallize into one undeniable truth, which was that no matter how many conversations we had, no matter how many envelopes I placed on her birthday table, and no matter how many documents I filed, to remove myself from obligations I never consented to, she would continue to look for ways to tether me back to her choices, because control for her wasn't a strategy, it was a survival mechanism. And letting me walk away freely was something she simply could not accept. I thanked the banker calmly, told him in writing that I declined to be listed on any account of hers, and hung up knowing that this was my final signal to end the cycle, not with words, not with temporary boundaries, but with a plan that was airtight, irreversible, and not open to negotiation. Months earlier, when I had first started this process with Ms. Patel, she had suggested I think about setting up my own trust, not because I had vast wealth to pass on, but because a living trust wasn't just about money, it was about clarity. It was about putting on paper the fact that my life was my own, and that nobody, not even family, could lay claim to decisions I didn't consent to. At the time it felt abstract, maybe even unnecessary, but after that phone call with the banker, it suddenly felt like the most essential move I could ever make. So I went back to Patel's office, sat across from her, and told her I wanted to build something that didn't just protect me but redefined what legacy meant in my life. Together we drafted a trust where I made it clear that I left nothing behind for anyone to fight over, that there would be no scraps of power or leverage to be dangled after my death, and instead, I dedicated a portion of my savings to something that had haunted me for years: the absence of support when I needed to change direction in my own career. The way my mother told me that pursuing anything other than the serious path she approved of was a waste of time, and how many nights I sat wishing someone would believe in me without conditions. That became the heart of my final move, a small scholarship set up in my grandmother's maiden name, not in my mother's, meant specifically for women starting over midlife, for those who needed a second chance to study, to retrain, or to prove that their worth wasn't tied to the approval of family or the timeline of youth. I chose my grandmother's name deliberately because she was the only one in that family who ever gave without strings, who ever slipped me a $20 bill as a teenager and said, "Spend it on whatever makes you happy, don't you dare give me a receipt." And I wanted her spirit, not my mother's control, to echo forward. When I signed those papers, I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as the release of a weight I had been carrying since childhood, because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to my mother's moves. I was making my own, and they were final. A few weeks later, when my mother had a minor health scare and called to inform me dramatically that she was in the hospital, I went to see her, but this time I did not sit at her bedside like the unpaid coordinator of her care, writing down instructions, answering nurses, or arranging follow-ups. Instead, I visited with my friend Tasha by my side. I stayed for exactly an hour. I listened without judgment, and then I left, handing the care coordinator the same list of elder law resources I had already given her months earlier. I was present, but I was no longer captured, and that distinction made all the difference. The final revenge, if you even want to call it that, wasn't about punishing her, because punishment still centers the person who caused the pain. The final revenge was about erasing the game altogether and building something new where she no longer had a role to play. To mark the end of this chapter, I hosted a small dinner with friends, the people who had stood by me without conditions, the ones who showed up when I was low and never asked for anything in return, and I announced the scholarship launch. I raised a glass in honor of my grandmother's name, not my mother's, and I told the people in that room that the legacy of control and manipulation ended with me, that from now on, the only thing my name would be tied to is freedom, choice, and second chances. Later that night, as I cleaned up the dishes and sat quietly in the glow of knowing I had done exactly what needed to be done, I thought about how much of my life had been wasted waiting for my mother's approval, waiting for her to recognize my worth, waiting for her to finally treat me as an equal, and I realized that the cruelest trick of all had been convincing me that I needed her to validate me in the first place. Now, standing on the other side of every envelope, every form, every decision, I understood that I had never needed to be chosen, I only needed to choose myself. And so, when people ask me if I regret smiling at her birthday table and telling her that being cut out of the will didn't matter, I tell them that smile was the truest expression of freedom I have ever known, because it wasn't about winning against her. It was about finally realizing the game was over. What if money was never the problem? What if the real contract was the silence we kept? Because once I broke mine, the entire structure collapsed, and in that collapse, I found the life I should have been living all along.